Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Garrison Institute's live interactive webinar. Today, our guests are Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm in conversation with Jonathan Rose. Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm teach at Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies and Yale Divinity School. They direct the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale, which arose from 10 conferences they organized at Harvard's Center for the Study of World Religions. Tucker specializes in East Asian religions, especially Confucianism. John specializes in indigenous traditions, especially Native American religions. Together, they made an Emmy Award-winning film, Journey of the Universe. Jonathan Rose's business, policy, and public policy, and non-for-profit work focus on creating more environmentally, socially, and economically responsible world. In 1989, Mr. Rose founded Jonathan Rose Companies, a multidisciplinary real estate development, planning, consulting, and investment firm. Mr. Rose and his wife, Deanna, are the co-founders of the Garrison Institute and serve as its board members and leads its Pathways to Planetary Health program. Before we begin today's session, I'll go over a few logistical items about our gathering. We're here on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video are turned off. You'll only see the presenters and for the time being myself. For anyone unable to attend live, we are recording these sessions. You'll have a chance to view the recordings as well as a schedule of upcoming programs at garrisoninstitute.org. We offer these sessions free of charge as a goodwill gesture to support our community during such times of heightened uncertainty. We would welcome donations of any amount to continue to offer these sessions. Thank you. Finally, we'll have time for Q&A during this gathering. You can post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is located at the bottom of your screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're on for an hour today and we'll respond to as many questions as we can. Please forgive us if we're unable to get to your question. Thank you again, Mary Evelyn, John, and Jonathan for being with us today, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, this is Jonathan Rose. Do we get to see each other, by the way, Amy? Because all I see is the logo. Oh, whoops, just a second, sorry.
There we go. It's right here.
Right, so we have to re-sign on our videos, Mary Evelyn and John.
Yep.
Perfect, good to see you. Oh, there you go.
Good.
Welcome, Mary Evelyn,
Good.
Tucker, and John Grimm. It's so wonderful to be with you again. And we were just recently together. So I want to start this. We're going to do a journey through history. Just for the audience, we're going to start in the present, and then we're going to go to the roots of religion and environment, and then we're going to work our way back, and then we're going to go to the future. So that's the brief outline of the journey. So very recently, His Holiness the Pope Francis issued something called Laudato Si, which was an extraordinary document really defining the terms of religion and environment and poverty today. And you had something to do with it too. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey with this document, both the thinking that went into it, what you feel like it accomplished, and what's coming out of it.
Well, it's a wonderful thing to start with this document because next week there's a whole week reflecting on it, all kinds of seminars and webinars and so on. And because it came out 5 years ago in 2015, actually on the Feast of Pentecost in May, and then officially released in June. But this is probably the watershed document for all of us working in religion and ecology, and that's because it integrates the social justice concerns of many of the world's religions, especially the Abrahamic traditions, with an environmental concern, and puts this together as what's called integral ecology. And so the phrase that comes in over and over again is cry of the earth, cry of the poor. And that phrase came from a book in a series that we did called Ecology and Justice from Orbis Books, by Leonardo Boff, one of the great theologians, liberation theologians from Brazil, who Thomas Berry had said to him many years earlier, Leonardo, you can't liberate people or even help people without healthy ecosystems. And Leonardo got this message and just took it forward. And that's the message that is really central to Laudato Si, because the Pope picks up this phrase over and over again. And integral ecology even was a term Thomas Berry had used years ago. So it's not that we had something to do, we helped midwife certain ideas and so on, but it was Thomas Berry, Leonardo Boff, and many, many other people who were writers and contributors to Laudato Si.
And it's wonderful to be with you, Jonathan, and everyone listening today, and I hope everyone is well. I would pick up, Jonathan, 3 points that I find remarkable about the structure of this encyclical. It's a teaching document, but the first point is the Pope makes it very clear he's addressing this to the human family on the planet Earth. So it's much larger than simply a document within his tradition. And secondly, unlike other encyclicals, which have been written over the decades now, this one opens with the science. And this is it's a religious teaching document, but he pays attention, especially to the climate science. And then finally, within House, he cites bishops' organizations, these councils of bishops in countries around the world. So he's obviously trying to build consensus within his own tradition. So on so many levels, this is a very interesting document.
And I would pick up the points that John just made to say, you know, at the actual launch at the Vatican in June 2015, the Pope wasn't even there. It was in the Academy of Sciences, the 500-year-old academy. But who was there? It's very symbolic to launch this. It was Cardinal Turkson, who's from Ghana. So the sense of the developing world and a leader from the developing world was there to represent the church. For interreligious and ecumenical dialogue, there was the Metropolitan John of Pergamon, who's the lead theologian, one of the lead theologians of the Orthodox Church, because Bartholomew, head of that church, has been a green patriarch. And third was a scientist from the Potsdam Climate Change Institute, John Schuldner. So this was very symbolic, reaching out to other religions, science, and the developing world.
So one of the ideas that I find so most powerful in it is that he called for an integral ecology, which you referred to, and he said that creates a universal communion that excludes nothing and no one. And so it was beyond human. It was the family of all relationality with all species.
Yes. Yeah.
And
well, it's such an interesting and old philosophical issue in the West, isn't it? The relationship of the one and the many. And I think you're pointing to something very interesting, Jonathan, in terms of interreligious dialogue. And I'm reminded of, say, that the Christian theologian Paul Tillich, who spoke of a multi-dimensional environmentalism or a concern for preserving difference. And I think our teacher, Thomas Berry, also had that type of concern.
Yeah, and I think what the passage you're quoting, brings us to a new phase of who we are as humans. And that's what Thomas Berry was also trying to suggest. This isn't just human-divine relations or human-human relations, but it's human-earth relations that we've got to reconstitute and re-inhabit. And one of the phrases he had was the earth community. And that is very significant because it embeds us within the life forces, the ecosystems, the biodiversity of this planet, a multi-billion year evolutionary process. I mean, that's the excitement of this moment, and even what the Pope is offering, because he cites Teilhard de Chardin, who had this sense of a huge developing, unfolding universe of which we are arise from, not dominate over.
So this actually brings me to, I want to show everybody this, which is your most recent book, which is a Thomas Berry biography. It's really fantastic because it's not just a biography of a person, but it's a biography of ideas. And there is a section in it on Teilhard de Chardin. And in fact, it expands the community to not only humans and nature and earth, but cosmology and the universe. It actually sees the way consciousness and love permeate the entire of creation. So would you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, this project on religion and ecology that we initiated 25 years ago was an invitation to the religious tradition, especially scholars and practitioners of the tradition who are committed to environmental concerns. So we brought together over 800 scholars over a 3-year period, and they explored their tradition. We use the term retrieval to talk about this hearkening back and bringing forward. So I brought along my Tanakh, my Hebrew scriptures, and I wanted to just reference Psalm 8. And in the Psalm is a particularly interesting take on the question of relations between human nature and early Jewish tradition, Israelite tradition. And the Psalm reads, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name throughout the earth. You who have covered the heavens with your splendor. From the mouths of infants and sucklings, you have founded strength on account of your foes, to put an end to enemy and avenger. When I behold your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and stars that you set in place, what is man that you have been mindful of him? Mortal man that you have taken note of him, that you have made him little less than divine and adorned him with glory and majesty. You have made him master over your handiwork." So we have in Psalm 8 this interesting tension between the role of the human in the presence of divine creation, and the passage presents the human as master of creation. And we know from the early reading in Genesis. So the retrieval within the traditions, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, the retrieval of these powerful connections with the natural world, and then beginning to reevaluate them. What do they say to us today? And finally, if the dominance passage is no longer meaningful to us, what's embedded in the terms? And so scholars ponder this retrieved text, they reevaluate it, and we begin to think about reconstructing traditions in light of these verses within traditions.
And I think one of the, just quickly, one of the things we
yeah.
discovered in this survey of 10 different traditions at Harvard and the books was that all of them have this cosmological dimension that you referred to, this celebration of the heavens. And I can read a passage from Confucianism later to illustrate that. But it's this embeddedness of the universe, of Earth and humans that's becoming more and more clear with both a scientific story of that and religious stories that are re-inviting us not to be masters, but to be stewards, to be caretakers, to be in communion with creation and nature.
Right. And Thomas Berry said basically to move from an object relationship to a subject relationship, which is also Buber Zion Thou.
Yes.
Exactly. That's one of his most famous passages,
Right.
is exactly that. The universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. And very much like Buber's I and Thou.
So I want to move us back now. So John, when was Psalm 8 written? When do we think it was written?
Probably at the period of the court of David, around 1000 before the current era.
Right. So I want to take us back in history because that was a time between 1500 BC and 500 BC or so. It was a time in which there was a lot of technical progress. We had the Iron Age and the Bronze Age and the wheel and the chariot, and this led to a lot of armies. And we see this in David, by the way, and conquering and violence. And we also see the growth of money, the coin and accounting systems and materialism. And these were not necessarily humans' best capacities. We also saw beautiful art flourishing and civilization growing, but it grew to a point where there was simultaneously around certainly Asia and Europe, but a reaction to all this violence and materialism. And it was called the Axial Age. So I want you to talk, both of you to talk about the Axial Age, and Mary Evelyn then lead that into Confucianism.
Karl Jasper, the German philosopher, is credited with first articulating this particular concept of a period, say, centered on the 6th century before the current era. And he would raise the question, why was it that both Confucius and the Taoist literary classics emerged? And then also in South Asia, India, we have the Upanishads and the great wisdom traditions there and the yogic teachings. And then in the Israelite tradition, the earliest prophets. And in the Greek context, the pre-Socratic philosophers. So he was seeing an axial intellectual.
And Buddha was 550 BC.
Thank you. That's I didn't mean to skip over that Siddhartha Gautama, but definitely 6th century. And so the sense that there's a definite turn towards interiority, and some have connected this axial age period then with a separation of the human from the natural world within the religious tradition. So this depth of interiority may also have played on that, but that's a question, I think, rather than simply a clear-cut answer. And along with the development of these traditions then, we think we can also posit forms of transcendence that are evident in all of these traditions.
Right, and that was one of the characteristics of this era, according to Jaspers and other historians and philosophers, that transcendence, a sense of a divine beyond this world, emerged in many of these traditions. Although East Asia is very different. And it's one of the reasons it intrigues me, because Confucianism and Taoism do not have a radical split between this world and the other world. And picking up on those ideas, it's actually the integration of cosmos, earth, and human in one continuity of being, connected actually by chi, by matter energy. But the beautiful cosmological passage that I'll share with you from Confucianism is one that illustrates that we humans, if we have filiality to our parents, gratitude for the gift of life, we should have it to heaven and earth as parents of all things. So this is a phrase, one of the most famous phrases in all of Chinese thought, and it's something that inspired me in my own graduate work and many, many others. So it's heaven is my father, earth is my mother, and even such a small creature as I has a place in their midst. Therefore, that which extends throughout the universe I regard as my body, and that which directs the universe I regard as my nature. All people are my brothers and sisters, and all things are my companions. That includes nature, biodiversity, the grasses, the trees, the sky, etc. So this became, we can talk about this again in a few moments, this becomes the basis in China for ecological civilization. How can we bring forward this tremendous integration that humans actually complete the creative forces of the universe and earth by their sense of the common good and contributing to the flourishing of life? And I just want to conclude maybe this section on the axial age, is that, again, Thomas Berry came up with this idea and Ewart Cousins expanded it in a book, but they were saying that we are now in a second axial age where these ideas, such as I just read from the 11th century Confucian Chang'ai, is now being put into thought, even policy in China, and even at the Garrison Institute that's picked up this idea of ecological civilization. So the notion is all these religions are coming forward with their ideas, with their spiritual wisdom, with their meditative practices and so on, and with their ecological potential ready to explode into a moral force, I think, at this moment in history. So that's the second axial age at this moment.
And I'd just like to make a connection, a resonance here with the point of integral ecology, Jonathan, that you had mentioned, and connect social justice and environmental justice. You can hear the concern for the poor, the widows in the Western inscription that Mary Evelyn read. And also we know social justice at the heart of the Abrahamic traditions also. And in this second axial age now, we're making this connection as you've just laid out. where social justice and ecological justice are coming into their integral connections.
Mhm.
So, Mary Evelyn, talk a little bit more about ecological civilization, because it's this magnificent aspiration that China has defined.
Yeah.
And yet we look at them as being the largest exporter of coal-fired power plants and a whole bunch of other things. So first describe the aspiration, then we'll try and reconcile the aspiration.
Right. Well, everywhere we're dealing with paradox,
Right.
with the ideals and the realities in
Right.
our own country as well, where
Absolutely.
democracy is
Absolutely in our own country.
so, and we like to say, by the way, we have this enthusiasm for this reconstruction of the traditions, but we do want to acknowledge the problems of religion are real, the intolerance, the sense of salvation outside this world, et cetera, et cetera. So you're highlighting something that's very important for us to be realistic about and practical about. So it's true that Chinese civilization has always had these aspirations for a common good, for a political system that was working actually for meritocracy, for education, for a broad number of their population. Although that didn't happen, and women's issues, et cetera, and all the religions are very problematic. But I would say this, in working with Du Weiming, one of the great contemporary Chinese Confucian scholars who we just celebrated his 80th birthday in Berkeley several months ago. So he has been working on this retrieval of Confucianism for the sense of their modern contribution to this complex of world religions. And so this is working through a philosophical system. All the philosophy departments in China are very aware of this revival of Confucianism and ecological civilization. On a popular level, Yu Dun, a woman who's a journalist in the university in Beijing, wrote a book, a commentary on the Analects, that sold 10 million copies. The Chinese parents are very eager for their children to be re-educated in the Chinese classics, something we never thought we'd see in a lifetime. So there's a new cultural learning that's happening in the school systems. And when we've taught, even in Korea and in China, students now know, to the Chinese students who came to Korea, they know the classics again. This is unbelievable. So there's this recovery of a tradition for a new way of being modern Chinese, because it's called New Confucianism, but also trying to contribute to the aspirations that we can't, and this is, I think, where the rubber meets the road, we can't have endless growth and we can't feed people in these old models. So that's part of where ecological civilization needs to be tweaked and in dialogue with scholars from the West and elsewhere, which is why the Garrison Institute's a perfect place to challenge and try and bring some of these ideas forward. A very short answer to a big question.
So John, I want to ask you about what we think of as an old model that did feed its people in balance and civilization, and that's the indigenous models. So we know that, or we believe that before the West brought its infectious diseases to the North America, we had 110 million people here, and we had millions of people living in South America. And what we think of as wilderness often in many, many cases was actually a cultivated landscape. It was cultivated by fire and cultivated by selection and the three sister plants, etc. And in fact, humans as gardeners on a vast scale, in some ways actually improved biodiversity, or they were essential element, they were a keystone species, a positive keystone species within biodiversity. So talk to us about that.
Yes, the image of indigenous people as first ecologists, the phrase itself is fraught with problems and promise, isn't it? Who are indigenous people? It's such differentiated peoples around the planet, and yet we have a singular term. We could do a whole webinar on this particular point, but just to make one comment and leave that issue The United Nations has put forward a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. So the use of that term in the United Nations context gives some indication of why the term indigenous has traction. Namely, it draws attention to small-scale societies with their own languages, cultures, their mythic traditions, their relationships to place. It draws attention to people who have been marginalized and much oppressed. So there's a social justice issue here. And in the midst of that attention to indigenous people, the environmental justice or the ecological justice issues also surfaced, because we have imposed upon indigenous people a trope or a literary way of identifying them with all of our environmental yearning. And I think that's a major problem in our understanding of indigenous people. And it is the case that we find many of these small-scale societies, they live in close proximity to the natural world, and they have deep mythic traditions, deep storied traditions. They transmit their wisdom often in relationship to place. So just to think of the Standing Rock, this community in Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, the Hunkpapa people stood in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline recently within the last few years, and that's an ongoing fight. And part of that effort was not just environmental resistance, but they articulated protection. They were protecting the people's relationship with water, water as life, water as medicine. So this sense of indigenous participation in environmental concern is a profound field for thinking about these issues. And in fact, over the years, we've had attention in one of the volumes from the Harvard series, the Indigenous Traditions and Ecology. There's some wonderful passages that I pulled out here, but I think it's, for a matter of time, it's not important to read them. But the issue of indigenous people is crucial and also appears in Laudato Si.
So going forward, talk about the idea of religious ecologies and religious cosmologies.
Yeah, so, you brought this forward early on, Jonathan, and I think this recovery that we don't just live in a bioregion, which is crucial, a local area and so on. We don't just live in a state or a nation or even a planetary system. We live in a solar system. And, 150 years ago, we had no idea how old our ancestry really is in terms of galaxies, stars, planetary systems, even the Earth. So 4.56 billion years of Earth systems and almost 14 billion years of universe unfolding. So what, again, Thomas Berry and what we discovered in looking at the world's religions in these series at Harvard is all the religions have their creation stories, their cosmogonies and their cosmologies, the cosmovisions of indigenous peoples. So we are trying to say in our work that a religious cosmology brings in this sense that we are children of the universe and so on. And therefore we have a responsibility. It's part of that filiality, filial piety. But religious ecologies make it very specific. We've just gone through Passover and Easter and so on, and Ramadan is taking place and the full moon is tonight. So the religious traditions are trying to weave humans into the ecological systems of place and of planetary systems. It's why we have Hanukkah and Christmas around the winter solstice, and people like Paul Winter have celebrated that at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, and so on. So these great movements of the earth and religious rituals and systems give that, we like to say, an orienting to the cosmos, grounding in earth systems, nurturing with the food and Shabbat food and so on, and then transforming with ethical force, with moral transformative power.
And these religious ecologies and religious cosmologies are transmitted in such striking ways within traditions. I'm thinking of within the Islamic tradition, the Quran itself, every verse of the Quran is called an ayat. And that same word, ayot, refers to every creature in existence, the singularity of every creature. So that sense of a religious cosmology embedded in a sense of relatedness throughout the ecology. Among native traditions, two experiences that I've had is to hear a Lakota person before going into a ceremonial say, Mitaku Yasin, all my relations. That brief phrase is transmitted in the tradition, and it's a religious ecology. I'm related to everything there is. And among the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois people, as it's said in English, the Haudenosaunee speak of a Thanksgiving prayer, where the person who's giving the prayer is literally looking at the horizon of being and praying from the sun down, clouds, rain, addressing all of the beings, the sense of a religious ecology transmitted in prayer to all of the communities. These are really powerful dimensions of traditions.
And my sense is for most of human history, these were not just teachings, these were experiences, that we lived in relationship with all of nature, and we lived in relationship with the cosmos, and that people who lived outside and under the stars, it was natural, their consciousness extended. They asked those questions of, where did I come from? Where am I going? Where is this? What is this magnificent thing? They perceived the chi of the universe even before they used that word.
Yes.
So, and they actually, in many different traditions, identify fairly similar elements. So I would love it if you would talk about air, water, soil, and fire, and how you see those today.
Well, what we tried to do in our little book, Ecology and Religion, actually, was pick up on this orienting, grounding, nurturing, transforming. And so we were teaching at Princeton at the time when we were writing this chapter, and we shared it with the students. And it was amazing to us how they jumped right in. Because one of the things we're, I think, all trying to do is get beyond the particularities of these traditions that can be sometimes brittle or self-enclosed or fossilized. And we're trying to open up the spiritual dimensions of them, the great wisdom traditions and contemplative practices. So just very briefly, the orienting is to the air, to the heavens, and breathing it in on a day like this in Connecticut is just magnificent. So the grounding is the earth coming through our feet, all this beauty that's pouring out right now with the flowers and the trees blossoming and blooming and so on. And the nurturing is water. As John has just said, water is life. To see those protests and people standing in the face of incredible conflict and saying, this is our sacred cosmology, ecology. So water is life. And then finally, the sense that fire, so many meanings for that, right? But that fire is the fire in the belly, right? And that's this transformative force, this chi, that again, Garrison is trying to encourage this in contemplative practice so that people can be servants for those going through trauma, health issues, and so on. So the sense of contemplation and action, brings all these elements together, I think, in very exciting ways. And the students just jumped in and they were like, well, I have this experience and so on.
I think it's evident within these traditions where we have seen communities who have gone through incredible moments of pain and suffering and have been able to come through because they are oriented in a particular way. They nurture themselves. They experience the pain, but they're grounded in it rather than it sweeping them away. And finally, they're able to make transitions. They transform themselves out of the Holocaust or out of these moments of deep desperation. Maybe even our own containment now is bringing some of these issues. We're coming face to face with them also. And I think that's where Thomas Berry was trying to explore also, what's our story? What's our way of looking into reality? So Mary Evelyn has been talking of the journey of the universe context in her remarks, and Thomas Berry was exploring that dimension also of a new story in our times.
So, actually that reminds me, researchers, social scientists And social psychologists were working with the women who remained in Rwanda, who survived the horrific conflict, who saw their husbands murdered and their children destroyed in front of them. And they discovered that some women were very resilient and recovered, and some women were destroyed. And when they asked why, it turns out that the women who had a worldview context, a kind of greater cosmology, were the ones that did much better. And this is like I'm going to now give an analogy which is really scientifically inaccurate, but it's almost as though the shards of their broken minds, like shards of grass, were pointing into their minds and continually hurting them. But those that had a worldview, the shards fit back together and smooth the points out into a holism.
It's a beautiful image, you know, fabulous, because we're all going through something like that right now, I think.
Yeah.
And, you know, Teilhard de Chardin, who was and is still a great inspiration to us, his vision came out of being a stretcher bearer in World War I, in the most horrific fighting. And he would say that even in this moment of destruction, I can see the creativity and destruction of the universe is unfolding. And that's what we're trying to elevate in Journey of the Universe. You know, that it's not just dualisms, it's a yin and a yang kind of a sensibility. And that if we are able to ground ourselves in stories, this isn't like the story, it's a story. But as we do that, we have a grounding for the creative action. Look at all the arts that are exploding right now over the internet. People's response to this moment is extraordinary.
So I want to talk about this one moment because we have a question from Rob Gabriel. Hello, Rob, which says, it's said that there will be a new normal after the pandemic. It seems to me that any new normal needs to include a weakening or a setting aside of the most toxic myths of modernity. Scientism, materialism, the primacy of economics, secularism. What do you think of the new normal? And is there a chance it could be more integral, communal, spiritual, and an earth community? And what can we do to make that happen?
What a wonderful question. And yes. But how do they come about? We are in a period of limits, and we're experiencing limits. And in the environmental movement, we talk about that so much. And in much of the work we've been talking about, the connection between cosmology and ecology is coming forward. And so these are the arenas in which I'm hoping that the new normal, if we can use such a phrase, that it will come out of communities who are drawing on very deep cosmologies, who have become awakened to their local ecologies, local ecosystems, and begin to live begin to walk through them and greet our neighbors now within these ecosystems. I think something is happening. Where it will go is a real question.
Well, I think it's a beautiful identification of the problems. And again, Thomas Berry was speaking about this 40 years ago of the scientism, of the commercialism, of economic models that just didn't fit. And now more and more people are saying this. And so I love the question. It's just to the point. And I do think that what we need to keep evoking and birthing is a science that is holistic, that's inclusive, that understands the animal world as sentient and thinking and feeling. We need to have a green economics and green business. John Fullerton's working on regenerative capitalism, and that's again a part of Garrison's work. And in all these fields, education, our it's now called the School of the Environment, and we are training some of the most creative generations we have seen in 45 years of teaching. Their commitment is unbelievable, absolutely extraordinary. So it's not that anybody can exactly see the future, but there's no question that something is a birthing and that we can be midwives to that process. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to be perfect. It won't even be fulfilled in our lifetime, but change is happening.
And I would say that three components that the Garrison Institute believes in are really three foundations, by the way, are deep contemplation, based in science, and compassionate action. And what we're seeing today is most remarkable is, first of all, because people are shut in.
Mhm.
We're seeing a dramatic rise of interest in meditation and yoga, but people are in a more reflective state. We have all been taken off the treadmill,
Yeah.
and the reflection is a good thing. The second one is science. That the whole thing about how we're going to solve this coronavirus, and everybody recognizes that science is going to do it, and we also know that and science is what should guide us as to how we open, et cetera. And I think there's a vast new appreciation of science. And the third thing, which is compassionate action. So in January and February, the Trump administration was whittling away at food stamps. They were kind of trying to get people off the food stamp roll.
Yes.
And now there's a bill in Congress and being discussed to dramatically increase food stamps.
Yes.
For 8 years, we saw battles about whether we should have more or less national payment, not national delivery, but payment for healthcare. And now, you'd be nuts to actually, nobody is running on the position that we should be cutting down on healthcare, and so on and so forth.
Yes.
By the way, Congress is about to release a bill to help poor people out of work pay for their rent, et cetera. So
Yes.
I think we have actually, these conditions have unleashed what may be not the new normal, but our new future.
Yes,
Yeah.
this compassion begins to bring us into deep inquiry about our economic exchange, our economic models now. And compassionate economics is finding a voice where we are assisting people whose work deprivation now puts them in a terrible position going forward.
Yeah, there's many, many people working on these issues for sure. You may have another question.
I got lots of other.
Okay, go ahead.
We are brimming with questions. By the way, there was one very brief one which asked just what was the citation on Mary Evelyn, that beautiful quote
Yeah.
you gave about filial relationship. Where did that come
So
from?
it's the Western inscription, and Chung Sai, C-H-A-N-G, T-S-A-I. He's an 11th century Neo-Confucian. It's sources of Chinese tradition. You can find it on 663, but you'll find it everywhere. Look up Western inscription. You can find it on the internet.
Good. So Ricky Ray asks, he's familiar with the technological source of alienation, but wonder if you talk about the psychological sources of alienation and whether there's a subconscious temptation in modern humans to remain alienated.
In the remove from the natural world, we have brought our alienation inside. We have this deep alienation even from our own subjectivity in that sense. So it is not surprising that we aren't able to really hear the voices of those telling the story of their emergence out of the universe, namely the creatures around us constantly speaking of their journey also. So we have this new awareness of the human being enfolded into the surrounding environment. We are part of the environment, but in fact, we are embedded in a community that's telling us, speaking to us about our mutual journey together.
And just briefly, that's a wonderful question, very profound. We have a book coming out on May 18th, which is open source, online, free, called Living Earth Community, with authors like David Abram and David Haskell, who did Song of Trees, that speaks to this sensibility of the livingness of the systems in which we are embedded, partly to overcome that sense of alienation.
And I think this also, the first axial period and the second axial period, I think this question relates to the transitions we're experiencing about an interiority that we now recognize in the world around us.
Okay, so we've several more questions. So Eric Potschacker from Germany asks, now I'm going to do a bunch of mispronunciations, but Zhao Ting Yang's book on the Tanxia system, are you familiar with that, Mary Evelyn? T-A-I-N-X-I-A system?
Chen. But what's the first part?
Zhao Ting Yang's book on the Tanxia system has received much attention. How does his take on Tanxia fit into an axial age? But if you don't know,
I can't see the words. Yeah.
T-I-A-N-X-I-A.
But who's the author?
Zhao
How do you
Ting
spell?
Yang. Z-H-A-O.
Yeah, Zhao.
Ting Yang, Tingyang.
Oh, okay. I'm not familiar with this book, so I can't, I don't think I can respond.
Okay.
Yeah,
So we'll
yeah.
talk. All right. Nora Gallagher asks, the apocalypse comes from Greek, as I understand it, and it means to be uncovered or unveiled. I feel as if everything is being uncovered all at once. Our extreme capitalism, our lack of public health, the chaos at the heart of the presidency. How does your sense of cosmology, mythology, and religion help integrate the truth of what's being revealed and find snatches of things that indicate a different future?
Our sense of Western apocalypse has generally been predicated on a linear view that its history is going somewhere. And then we see these end moments as the end of things rather than the beginning of something new, a kind of cyclical view as we find in many of the other Asian indigenous peoples have a cyclical view. So this idea of the uncovering, it really is a beautiful understanding of the word apocalypse rather than simply an end to something that we're coming into an awareness of that which will carry us forward too.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I want to just share something that I find very hopeful amidst what leaves me sleepless and has left me sleepless for years, which is the destruction of our environment and all the things that were way before this period. I want to just share, I'm on a new working group at the Vatican, Ecological Working Group, that they're trying to put out some statements on our present moment. And this is what I want to share against the apocalypse, is that the Vatican is going to support and is doing a paper on a universal Green New Deal, which is going to put integral ecology into the specifics of a need for new economy, ecological integrity, and equity issues. I think it's mind-blowing. And the Europeans are very supportive of a Green New Deal as well. So I think we have forces that are at work here to count as counterpoints to collapse, which is also at play. There's no question.
You know, what I would say is also that what religious ecologies and religious cosmologists, forget the word religious, having a sense of connection to ecology and to cosmology makes things palpable. You feel them versus just thinking them.
Yes.
And we can think our way, we can rationalize our way into all kinds of assaults on Earth and assaults on other people. And I mean, wars are, but when you feel this deep interdependence and connection, I think that leads to a different kind of answer, of action.
Yeah. Wait, there's this.
Let him do another question.
Okay. Sorry. So Michael Narn asks, as a follow-up to a question on the new normal, modernism has brought us an attitude of certainty. Is there a path of an informed attitude of wonder and awe and uncertainty that allows us to develop an ethic of honoring nature and its systems that sustain us?
That's a beautiful question. So that's why we did Journey of the Universe, to evoke wonder, awe, beauty, complexity, randomness, and purpose mingling together in this huge process, but especially to say from our human body, which is mind-boggling how it works, to any ecosystem which we barely understand. And that's the uncertainty that is part of this. I think science is becoming a little more humble in saying restoration is on the horizon here, but we don't really know fully how to restore ecosystems, and we've done not always well in that. So this is a superb question, and that's what we're trying to do is evoke awe, wonder, beauty, but humility also.
And I think it's part of the modern challenge and the modern dilemma. And I find it, say, with indigenous elders who have some clear understanding of the tradition that has come to them, the richness of their exchange with place, and yet they have been marginalized and have lost so much of their tradition. And then even their economic capacity is so dimmed down, so diminished. And yet they pass on a wisdom understanding that in the midst of that this uncertainty that we live in, the struggle to be who we are, to find who we are, even when we don't even know some of the dimensions of our own tradition. I think now that struggle is something that faces all of us in the modern communities.
So I would like to counter your point where you said we don't know how to restore ecosystems, and with the point that when you leave nature alone, it knows how to heal.
Yes.
So not only are we seeing like dolphins now swinging in Venice and the water's cleared up, but whenever we leave an area around, one of the things I find really interesting is around Cape Canaveral or Cape Kennedy in Florida, where they launch all these rockets. So they have a security zone in the water of so many miles around it. And within that, and so there's been no fishing and no boats and nothing in there for 50 years now. And the ecology's, I don't want to say completely restored, but significantly restored because we just left it alone.
That's right.
Yeah, the
So
DID between the Koreas.
Right.
Yeah.
So the idea, exactly. So the idea of the half Earth, E.O. Wilson's half Earth, is take half the most important birthplaces of biodiversity, generative parts of the Earth, and just leave them alone.
Yeah.
So Nicholas Parker asks, how might our identification with and use of technology change given what you have said?
I think we begin to understand technology as a means for accomplishing the ends that our wisdom traditions and our encounter with our own limits now, what we begin to be aware of. So a technology that is focused on flourishing the Earth community. So it's not an abandonment of technology, and it's not just appropriate technologies, but it's technologies that assist the flourishing of the Earth community.
Yeah, when we showed Journey of the Universe with Chinese subtitles in Beijing in October at the Yale China Center, and we had Confucian scholars respond to it, bringing together tradition and modernity. It was fabulous. And 77,000 people watched it in China. This is the technological reach that I think we all know is possible. The same with our online courses on Journey. So I think, this is, again, such a great question. I don't think we have the full answer, but if we can use it for this kind of outreach, even photography that shows us the opening up of a seed. Our former dean, Peter Crane, had a 50 million year old seed. The technology was mind-boggling that he could talk about awe and wonder.
So there's this marvelous resonance with the earlier questions about apocalypse also in the sense of our dimensions of time. There is in the Islamic tradition a hadith, it's a minor hadith, that the Prophet Muhammad was asked, at the end of time, what should we do? At the apocalypse, what should we do? And Muhammad, without any hesitation, said, plant a tree. And that sense of a future orientation of life, I feel, is what we motivated us with this act of restoring or renovating our website. The forum is 25 years old now, and we had a very old website full of information. But that kind of technological renovation is for us an understanding that all of this comes out of the earth, all of our energy, all of our communications mediums, that somehow we take responsibility for what we're doing, the sound that we're transmitting, all of this to plant a tree, as Mohammed.
There's so two things. First of all, you've referred several times to your universe story. And so people should know there's a book and there's a magnificent movie. Do you want to tell us how people can find it?
Sure. If you go to journeyoftheuniverse.org, the film's available on Amazon streaming. We can also put up on the website later a link that you can watch it at home or wherever. And there's a book from Yale Press, and there's a series of 20 conversations of interviews I did with scientists and environmentalists. Again, we'll be happy to give you the link. And there's these MOOCs, massive open online courses through Yale Coursera. About 27,000 people are watching them now. And so all of this we'll put on the Journey of the Universe.
Journey of the Universe.
Yeah.
So I want to, we're moving towards the end, unless there's another question that comes in. And I just want to underscore what John just said and about Mohammed saying, plant a tree. So there's a photographer, Sebastião Salgado, who has traveled the world and taken magnificent and disturbing pictures of migrants and of people, of the deep suffering throughout the world. And eventually this burned him out and tore him apart. And he retreated to a family farm, and there's a beautiful film about this too.
Yes.
Yeah.
He retreated to a family farm in Brazil. And it too, like the way we have treated the world, had been overgrazed by cattle and had been reduced to just almost a barren stubble of grass. And he started planting trees, and he started and by the way, and the land was dry and parched, and he started just planting trees. And in it, he healed himself,
Yes.
and he healed the land. And literally 10 years later, the streams began to come back as the moisture got, I guess, held by the roots and kept in shaded from the sun by the branches of the trees. And 20 years later, there were streams and birds and animals and an entire ecology. So remember I said earlier that leave nature alone and it will come back.
Yeah.
Leave nature, but have nature and the hand of a human who's a gardener, who gardens with compassion and to heal the way we have ripped the fabric of life. And together,
Right.
I think we can
I couldn't agree more.
Jonathan, I feel the depth of your image every time I look at the statue of the seated Buddha gesturing to the earth. And of course, that's in the story of the earth coming to respond to one of the temptations of Mara. But now I feel the Buddhist gesture is restorative to the earth. We are giving to the earth.
Yeah. I think I see one more question there. Is that right?
It just says, many thanks for this conversation today. So we have 2 minutes left. Do either of you have a closing thing you want to say? By the way, John, I thought that was perfect, the Mara comment.
Yeah, that sense of gesturing. I have a lovely Taoist story that I was going to read, but the gist of it is a gentleman gave a magnificent banquet, and someone said, "Isn't it wonderful we have all this food?" And he made the comment, "Yes, heaven has given all of this to us." And they all applauded, but a 12-year-old boy stood up and he said, No, it isn't just given to us humans. It's given to all of the creatures. And if we say that because we eat the creatures that are given to us, then the mosquito or the tiger could say that we are given to them. So the wonderful sense in Taoism that the Tao, being great, recedes. And having receded, it goes away. And having gone away, it disappears. And having disappeared, it returns. And I feel that with this work that we're trying to do, it's very difficult to get hold of, but it draws us forward. Even as it recedes, it disappears, and we know it returns again.
That's why John's a Taoist and I'm a Confucian, and our yin yang is a great blessing. And so is the community that's joined us here. And Garrison, we are so grateful,
So appreciate
Jonathan, for hosting and moderating this, and for all of your team. You're doing extraordinary work at the Garrison Institute, and we're very happy to be a partner with you for a long, long time. Thank you.
Thank you. So Mary, just one again, could the name of the film? Oh, maybe the person wanted the name of the Salgado film, which I don't know what it is, but Amy, I see you've returned.
Yes, I just don't want to jump in. If you're finished with your conversation, I will close then. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mary, Evelyn, John, and Jonathan, for this beautiful conversation and for being with us today. Thank you, everyone who joined on the call. And our next session is on Monday, May 11th with Gayla and Aaron Stiles. Please keep checking garrisoninstitute.org for updated listings of future sessions and to view the recordings of this call and others. Again, we provide these sessions free of charge. If you would like to support this effort, please consider making a donation at garrisoninstitute.org. May everyone be happy, healthy, and safe.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.